We didn't understand it. On its own, every piece of the car, even down to the most inane bolts, looked like the opposite of what you wanted it to be for a proper, functional car. But when put together, we were even more lost, as the car looked nonsensical. Of course, as Christian pointed out, we had yet to put on the floor and the final touches. But you could see from the onset that it wasn't designed like the rest of the cars. It was at that moment when Adrian came out of the workshop, which had been reformed weeks before at a frantic pace to meet his sudden demands. It was strange how he was the only one who was allowed to work on the floor. But this was his baby, and therefore he was in command. The words he uttered then, a simple "It is done," sent chills through my spine, down to my very feet. As if I was standing on the tallest precipice and looking at the darkest void known to mankind. His eyes looked vacant and a little lost, like those men you see in Arkham's sanitarium, who have seen something wrong that should have never been seen. And it came to me that if I kept eye contact with him for a little longer, I would too belong in that place. I looked at my colleagues who went to get the floor to install it in the car. But as I went to join them, something made me stop just before the threshold of the workshop, as if my own gut was telling me the wrongness that laid inside. Now I know I should have listened to it, but I didn't, and my hubris determined my doomed fate. Out of the blue, the 3 engineers came out of the workshop, running and trembling and screaming incoherently, cursing the world and themselves while mauling at each other. One of them dashed to the fuel pump and doused everyone before drinking himself to death, his fuel-bloated stomach protruding and bursting. Another kept throwing himself at the wall head first, as if trying to erase the memories of what he had seen inside Newell's chamber. The last one jumped at me and kept clawing my face, screaming about curses and horrors and doom, before his eyes became like Adrian's and suddenly collapsed on me. Terrified, yet still in shock, I looked as Christian and Adrian took my friend's corpse off me and helped me stand. The crackpot engineer, still with his dazed stare, kept nudging me forward, while muttering, "Go on," and something that sounded like, "Give me." Yet I didn't understand what he wanted me to give him before he pushed me through the door and locked it behind me. At this point, I knew I was in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. I felt it on my skin, on my bones, and on my very soul. And yet, as I stood there, refusing to stare at it, blood and sweat and tears pouring down my face, I couldn't help but wonder what had turned my fellow engineers into madmen. And so, I looked into the abyss. At first, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. This was supposed to be the floor of a Formula One car, and yet it didn't make sense. The shape and the dance of the metal defying the laws of physics and every principle of aerodynamics. Yet the figures on it seemed as if they were ever changing and shaping themselves into impossible figures and spirals that formed a maddening labyrinth whose only purpose was to entrap its inhabitants forever with no way in or out. Its curls and streets and spires taunting and clamoring for me, and I could see my colleagues screaming at me and begging, and I saw myself with them. And I saw now that the point of the floor was to entrap me and them and everyone else who had the misfortune of being offered to this creature who promised and whispered and talked of negative forces and friction and impossible creatures and living yet dreaming in our dimension and beyond, who conspired against each other, who used humanity as they saw fit, like we were nothing to them, and I felt my mind shatter at my own insignificance. When I came back to my senses, it was as if a strange being had commandeered my own body. As I felt myself tightening the last nuts and bolts of the floor into the car, I sensed how it relinquished control. But I knew it was only temporary, since I was cursed and bound to the being that laid below the car. And it sat there, unassuming, waiting, as if it wasn't there. From the outside, it looked like a regular F1 car, and yet somehow it looked wrong, as if it was something that shouldn't be there, that shouldn't be like that. And if you were to peek down below, you too would be sucked into its spiral of madness. "Is the car finished?" I heard Max ask, unfazed by the carnage produced by the being that dealt with Nui, while something inside me that I recognized as what was left of my own sense of humor pointed out that the souls and minds weren't part of the ghost cap. "Gimme," I answered, as a sudden buzzing started piercing through my head, as if a million wasps were swimming through my head, while an ominous mantra resounded that, like an exploding volcano, bubbled through my mouth. "Gimme! Gimme! Gimme!" I had to take them out of my head. I needed the buzzing to stop. I clogged my ears and my mouth and my nose and my eyes, yet they were out of reach. "Gimme! Gimme! Gimme! Gimme!" And I was falling and thumping my head on the floor. I wanted it to stop, and I could feel Max, Christian, and Adrian watching me kill myself, and yet I could only see the being that posed itself as a car laughing at me, mocking me for my humanity, while it devoured me whole. "Gimme! Gimme! Gimme!"